Hello, this is my third and final video on Ahmad Ashraf's Islamic political movements in 20th century Iran. The article appears in Encyclopedia Iranica. It was first published in 2007 and then updated in 2012. As I said in the first video, this is only my summary of someone else's work, so if you have any substantial questions about the article, it's best to take them up with the author directly. The article is available online, so I encourage you to read it for yourselves. Obviously, you'll have to refer to the article if you want to look at the author's source material. So it's a very long article and very well worth reading. It effectively divides into three sections, the first of which, developments in the period prior to the Islamic Revolution in 1979, I covered in the first video. The second section on political developments from 1979 onwards, I'm basically leaving out. And then the third one, which is the longest, is on ideological divisions in Islamic movements and Islamic political ideologies in practice, and I've divided that into two separate videos, so we're now on to the second of those two. So, ideological divisions in Islamic movements. Ashraf talks about four related issues which are significant in terms of dividing the various Islamic movements in Iran. We've covered the first three of those, that's Islamic modernity, militancy, and economic policy, in the second video of the series, and now we'll move on to the third one, which is about democracy and related issues. So after that, we'll conclude by going through a very short section at the end of the article on Islamic political ideologies in practice. So now let's turn to the article. So one major question is, how compatible is Islam with democracy? And the pro-democracy Islamic thinkers obviously think it is, and the fundamentalist ones don't. So a more fundamental and controversial aspect of modernity for Islamic movements is humanism, and more specifically the degree of freedom of human agency and compatibility of Islam with democracy. Modern humanism, according to Ashraf, can be simply defined as a system of thought that rejects all supernaturalism and relies primarily upon reason and science, as well as concern with the needs, well-being, and interests of people. Secular liberalism and Marxism may both be considered as major political manifestations of humanism, both having influenced particular Islamic movements. In the Abrahamic religions, there has evolved two polarized perspectives in response to the spread of modern secular humanism. First, an uncompromisingly outright rejection of humanism by fundamentalists of various religions, and then secondly, a more moderate, compromising view that propagates the compatibility of religious faith with a modified conception of humanism as mediated by God. The receptive attitude towards modified definitions of humanism is evident in the pronouncements of the compatibility of Islam with both democracy and socialism, which we'll talk about in a minute. So let's first of all talk about the fundamentalist response. As with the adherents of fundamentalist movements in Abrahamic faiths in general, Judaism, Christianity, and other branches of Islam, a primary target of Iranian Shia fundamentalism is humanism, conceiving man to be the center of the universe. The cardinal objective of fundamentalism is therefore to reinstate the idea in practice that God, not man, is the center of the universe. The fundamentalists also maintain that the path to social justice lies in a return to the original fundamental message of the scripture, in this case the Sharia, and the formation of a religious state combined with the rejection of innovations and perceived anti-religious ideas and practices stemming from the secularization of the world. The targeted innovations which are rejected include the modern secular state and its tolerance towards the institutions of a pluralistic civil society and the separation of church, religion, and state. In addition, most fundamentalist movements bitterly scorn any tolerance of, or much less collaboration of, their religious establishments with the secular state. And in the same vein, they oppose all religious intellectuals with pro-democracy or socialist orientations, accusing them of succumbing to the evils of humanism and the ostensibly false belief of the compatibility of Western forms of democracy or socialism with Islam. This stance also signifies the fundamentalists' conviction of being the guardians of absolute truth, founded upon immutable and historically unchanging religious principles in pursuit of the right path enjoined by God, as well as possessing the sole blueprint for establishing the perfect society in all aspects of life: political, social, economic, religious, and cultural. The concept of absolute truth is evident, for example, in the title of the manifesto of the Fedayeen Islam, the Guide to Truth. Such a rigid notion of an invariable absolute truth rests upon a dualistic Manichaean vision of the world and its division into two opposing forces of good and evil: faith and blasphemy, Allah and Taghut, true Islam and false Islam, and the friends and foes of Islam. This worldview justifies extreme and violent political action without constraints in defense of truth, serving as a rationalization for the envisaged totalitarianism of the Fedayeen Islam and other groups, or even the extreme totalitarian worldview of the New Fundamentalists. Another feature of fundamentalism in this regard has been the frequent recourse to violent enforcement of prescribed religious codes of conduct when and where possible, by resorting to the principle of religious duty in Islam. It should be noted that the belief in the existence and knowledge of absolute truth also exists among the adherents of some secular as well as religious left groups, such as certain trends within liberation theology in Latin America and the Islamic left, including the People's Mujahideen, that's the Mujahideen Khalq of Iran, who justify recourse to violence in bringing about their own order of truth in the form of social justice. So now let's turn to the New Fundamentalist Discourse and Western philosophy. The underlying epistemological difference between secular humanism and fundamentalism in Iran has been intensified by the New Fundamentalists' adoption of anti-humanist ideas drawn from Western philosophy. These ideas can be treated in two related currents, from perennial traditionalism and Heideggerian anti-humanism. So first, the perennial traditionalist perspective. This can be characterized as essentially metaphysical, esoteric, and primordial. It began to emerge in Europe and America at the beginning of the 20th century through the works of scholars such as René Guénon and Ananda Kumarasamy. It was developed further by Guénon's disciple, Fridtjof Schuon, and their followers, including Sayyid Hossein Nasr, who edited the essential writings of Fridtjof Schuon in 1986. Most of the adherents of perennial traditionalism later converted to Islam, and a number of the works by them have been translated into Persian in the last 2 decades and have further bolstered the ideological position of New Fundamentalism in Iran. Now we move on to Martin Heidegger's anti-humanism and anti-modernism, which has also influenced political Persian religious thought through Henri Corbin, the influential scholar in Islamic philosophy, and his disciple Said Hossein Nasr, and more specifically through Ahmad Fadid. Corbin, by the way, was the first to translate Heidegger into French, something I'd never realized. Heidegger's ideas of the decadence of the West through the concept of the darkening of the world, a recurring theme in his philosophy, introduced and articulated by Fadid through the coinage of its Persian equivalent, Garb-Zadagi, which is sometimes translated as West toxication, meaning the darkening of the Western world, which has contaminated the East. Drawing from this concept, Fadid and his disciples founded a new version of Heideggerian fundamentalism in post-revolution Iran. Heidegger spoke of a darkening of the world to mean the loss of humanity or the enfeeblement of the spirit and forgetfulness of being in the modern world. Following Heidegger, Fadid emphasized that the decadence of the West had already begun with Greek philosophy, which marked the human being's loss of oneness with spiritual consciousness. Western man, according to this view, immersed in technology, is more concerned with his being than with his spiritual calling in the world. The liberal conception of civil society and democracy are illusions in a world in which being and spiritual consciousness are no longer in unison, but at odds. Fadid claimed that the Islamic Revolution served as the vehicle for a return to the authentic spiritual ethos of the East. Fadid asserted that Heidegger is the only philosopher whose thought corresponds to the fundamental ethos of the Islamic Republic founded by Imam Khomeini. Fadid gained followers among a circle of people in seminaries and the intelligence forces, as well as in the editorial staff of the major daily Kayhan newspaper and in various journals. These ideas, drawn from anti-modernist currents in Western philosophy and religious thought, were transmitted to the Iranian audience through translation of a number of works of Western adherents of anti-humanist ideas, and by such scholars as Said Hossein Nasr. Following the perennial traditionalism of Guénon and Schorn, as well as the Heideggerian Corbanian anti-humanist ideas, Nasr advocated an apolitical traditionalist Islam vis-à-vis both modernism and fundamentalism. Yet his ideas of anti-modernism have substantially buttressed the ideological position of new fundamentalism, with a hardline political agenda in the last 2 decades. Consequently, the main division within the respective political factions since the 1990s has come to be defined by the conflicting ideological poles of new fundamentalism, with its totalitarian proclivity on one hand, and the new Islamic pro-democracy thought on the other. So now let's talk about Islamic humanism and the pro-democracy and socialist takes on Islamic ideas. As the proponents of pro-democracy and socialist-oriented Islamic platforms often resort to the idea that man, as God's emissary on earth, has been entrusted by God with a relative freedom of action. No one can deprive man of this divine right, nor substitute it to the vested interests of a particular individual or group. The proponents of varying brands of Islamic humanism occupy a middle ground between secular humanism and religious fundamentalism. This stance, in contrast to the absolute and diametrically opposed views of religious fundamentalists and secular humanists, asserts the centrality of both God and man at the center of the universe. In this way, religious intellectuals with pro-democracy and socialist orientations rationalize the idea of human agency mediated by God's will and God's endowment of humanity with the capacity for freedom and creativity. The proponents of mediated humanism can be divided into two distinct groups. First, those like Bazargon and Shariati, who mediate the distance between man and God by referring to the original sources, thereby demonstrating the compatibility of Islam with democracy or socialism through the adoption of universalistic Western political principles and their Islamic textual collaborations. Second, you have those like Mujtahid Shabastari and Saroush, who, transcending the above old ways, reconstructed a new theological approach concerning the question of the compatibility of Islam with the ideas of freedom and democracy. So let's start off with Mehdi Bazargon. As a French-educated engineer in the 1930s, who was familiar with the modern sciences and political philosophy, Bazargon developed a pristine approach in a number of influential books, expounding the compatibility of Islam with Western science and technology, freedom and democracy. In his book Man and God, Bazargon sought to bridge the deep chasm between the place of God and man in the center of the universe. He maintained that the common element in both religion and democracy is the principle of man's nobility, from which the ideas of human freedom and human rights, responsibilities, and political participation are derived. In his view, Islam, along with the monotheistic religions in general, bestows great respect on human rights and considers mankind, as free, responsible, and having autonomous agency. He makes a sharp distinction between the essence and precepts of religion, which belong to God, and the administration of the polity, which belongs to the people. The former falls under religious rules, and the latter under man's rules. He concludes that freedom to oppose and criticize an object is vital and necessary for both government and religion. When freedom is banished, then tyranny will take its place. Then we have Ali Shariati. Religious intellectuals with socialist tendencies, such as Shariati, have shown a similar inclination towards mediated humanism and authenticity. Divine revelation, Shariati argued, has left certain matters up to human creative and inventive intervention, not because the revelation is incomplete or imperfect, but because humans have been granted the capacity for rational and moral action. He argued that we are justified in using these powers to create a social democratic system because these powers are what make us truly human. Shariati maintained that man is created by God with the ability to make choices and to create social and political systems in keeping with their authentic values, including the rejection of traditional clergy. A theological breakthrough. Now, both Saroush and Mujtahid Shabastari have constructed a novel theory of the compatibility of Islam with democracy, which seems to be based on a new theological approach. The old democracy approaches, from the Constitutional Revolution to Bazargon's liberation movement, referred mostly to the ideas of freedom, human rights, and democracy as contained in the original sources of scripture and tradition. This new paradigm, however, advances a pro-democracy Islamic theory by focusing on extra-religious sources. The new theory's main objective is to seek answers to the following questions. How is a system of democracy, freedom, and human rights possible in Islam? And by what theological method and in what sources may one find an answer to that question? Soroush begins his argument in support of the compatibility of Islam with democracy with the premise that human beings aspire to freedom in the modern age, and that the best way to attain freedom is democracy. Yet, since the values of freedom and democracy and its criteria are extra-religious values, democracy cannot be reconciled with Islam without unearthing available sources for rationalization of the basis of democracy in religion. The task of the political philosophers in the world of Islam, Soroush believes, is to reconcile religion and freedom by giving a new interpretation of religion to make it possible to link religion with democracy. His mode of reconstruction recognizes the autonomy of the sphere of human values from that of religion. Resorting to philosophical and theological traditions in medieval Islam, Soroush shows that there are ideas which could be independent of Islam without being incompatible with the faith. To this end, Soroush constructs a new interpretation of religious ideas and principles by making a distinction between the absolute, immutable principles of religion and its mutable aspects. The main task for Soroush, therefore, is to unfold the basic purposes of the Sharia by way of interpreting the concepts, theories, and principles of religious texts. Once we unfold the basic purposes of divine law, Soroush contends, we would be able to undertake a new reading of the mutable aspects of the text. In expounding his theory, Soroush makes a distinction between maximalist and minimalist perspectives of religion. Maximalists believe that all aspects of Islamic social life must be derived from religion. Soroush contends that most of the current problems in Islam can be traced to such a perspective. It leads, he maintains, inexorably down a path towards a totalitarian regime. Replacing this position with a minimalist view would solve the problem. He argues that some values cannot be derived from religion, such as respect for human rights and even freedom. Therefore, freedom has to be treated from the favorable sources of theology. Islamic philosophers, Soroush says, should change their conception of man and focus on the idea of justice, connotating man's freedom of action in his relation with God's justice, one of the 5 principles of Shiism and one of the key concepts in Mutazilite theology. Mutazilite theologians, Soroush argues, have already explored this area extensively and provided us with the tools to solve many of our problems. For his part, Mujtahid Shabastari, a pro-democracy theoretician of clerical background, maintains that democracy and human rights are historically evolving concepts, and as such were not, either in their current form or substance, conceived at the time of the revelation of the Quran and the formation of Islamic traditions. The foundational religious sources cannot therefore be expected to contain guidelines on attaining democracy and human rights in our time. The answer to the compatibility of Islam with democracy and human rights, he contends, should therefore be sought not in the foundational religious sources, but in extra-religious sources. He further suggests that in order to bring about democracy and human rights, one must consult and follow models outside the foundational religious sources, even if these models tend to be secular and grounded in Western modernity and humanism. Not unlike Soroush, Mujtahid Shabastari espouses the view that due to the limited capacity of religious dogmas to address the many complex issues and needs of the modern world, religion should be complemented with the extra-religious rational values and practices that have emerged in response to the new circumstances, challenges, and requirements of modern societies. The complex political, social, economic, and cultural characteristics of modern times are historically specific and evolving variables, and thus distinguishable from the eternal values of religion, which by definition are assumed to be unchangeable. He rejects the claim that anyone can have exclusive knowledge of the absolute truth, and debunks any claim that God's absolute truth could ever be accessible to humans. In his view, the ideas of freedom and democracy are compatible with Islam, not as Bazargon believed, because one finds parallel terms in the Quran or the traditions, but because one can rationally assume that these modern ideas are compatible with the spirit of Islam and its concept of justice. He further suggests that democracy is not divisible into Islamic or non-Islamic forms. Rather, the nature of government in any society is either democracy or dictatorial. Whether people should follow divine laws and values in establishing a political order is in the domain of the philosophy of law and ethics, and is therefore irrelevant to the nature of government itself. Summing up his arguments, Mojtahid Shabastari concludes that although there are various models of democracy, any attempt to constrain the form of government by religious laws and beliefs would lead not to the establishment of a specific form of democracy, but to the emergence of a specific model of dictatorship. Finally, let's talk about the last section of the paper on Islamic political ideologies in practice. This is quite a short section. Considerable differences and animosities have emerged among the various proponents of Islamic pro-democracy ideas, Islamic socialism, Islamic fundamentalism, and a newcomer, Islamic pragmatism, in the post-revolution era, when their position was transformed from opposition forces mobilizing against the previous regime to one of competing factions for scarce political, economic, and social resources within the Islamic Republic. They often deny the shared elements of their ideas and practices, and their competition for the same Islamic political space has frequently involved denunciations and violence. Does this antagonism stem merely from their material interests and thirst for political power, or is it born out of their conflicting ideas and utopian beliefs, or combinations thereof? To answer this question, one must note that ideology is an organized collection of ideas, forming the basis of a political philosophy or program, often shows an elective affinity with the material and non-material interests of certain social classes and groups who adopt them. This selection of ideas, in turn, influences the mode of thinking and behavior of the people. Political ideology either offers the rationalization for the survival of an established order, or suggests blueprints for a desired change in social, political, or economic systems. A shift in conflicting ideological issues in society may also influence the competing political currents in modifying their ideological orientations. For example, the question of religiosity versus non-religiosity, or allegiance to Islam versus anti-Islamic or even non-Islamic orientations, became the main controversial issue during the early post-revolutionary period, whereas focusing on the priority of public versus private sectors of the economy became the main conflicting ideological issue during the period of the Iran-Iraq war under the leftist government of Mousavi from 1981 to 1989. Finally, democracy versus totalitarianism became the main controversial issue in factional politics during the period of the 1990s and 2000s. In practice, the proponents of various Islamic ideologies often formed coalitions and counter-coalitions depending on the political imperatives of the time. They have engaged in continuous intra- and inter-factional competitions and rivalries that have reflected their material and political interests no less than their ideological positions. One major new player has also emerged. Since its formation in the early years of the Revolution, the Revolutionary Guard Corps and its affiliated agencies, including the paramilitary forces, intelligence services, security forces, and large commercial and industrial enterprises, has vastly expanded its powers in relation to all other parts of the state. In the first phase of this expansion, which took place during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the Revolutionary Guards served as a military force that was entirely subordinate to the top leadership of the Islamic Republic, that is, to Ayatollah Khomeini as the commander-in-chief. In the last years of the war, however, and more specifically after the death of Khomeini, the Guards' performance was criticized, often by some leading figures of the clerical establishment. This prompted some commanders of the Guards to seek a relatively independent power base from the clerical leadership of the regime. By the late 1990s, the Guards had succeeded in achieving considerable power and were fast becoming a semi-independent force, effectively a state within the state. As such, they exerted increasing influence over most government agencies and in many instances managed to appoint senior officers to key positions in the civilian bureaucracy. They also promoted a new hardline fundamentalist ideological orientation, one that had emerged from within the Guards and its paramilitary forces in the 1990s. In the ensuing years, and particularly since the defeat of the reformist movement in the 2005 presidential elections, the Guards and its affiliates and allies seem to have gained a near complete monopoly of power and control over the entire state. So thank you for listening, and in particular my thanks to my patrons Ian Palin and Tricia Williams. If you like these videos, you're very welcome to subscribe to my channel. I'll try to answer any questions you may have about it in either on Patreon or perhaps in a future video. Those who want to support the development of the channel can do so through Patreon or PayPal. I'll give details below in the description. Please also click the like button if you wish, so that I can get an idea of which video is of greatest interest to viewers. Have a good day.